to the third lecture of the semester in the third annual faculty lecture series. This series allows faculty to present an area of interest and let you get to know some of us in a little different way, lets you experience some academic pursuits that may open areas of interest to you as well, and it gives you the opportunity to see what colleges and universities do. Frequently have these lecture series and opportunities for exchange of ideas and research. Please extinguish all cell phones and encourage your children to be silent if they are here with you. Please use only the wooden doors over here unless those doors remain open. If you need to leave early, we will watch the time. I'm not speaking, so you'll be out early, and we will take care of you. At the end today, on your way out over here, the Student Government Association is having a bake sale, and they've asked me to announce that to you also, so please support the Student Government Association. Now, without further ado, I'm quite honored to recommend my friend and colleague of many years, Mr. Jim Walsh. Mr. Walsh was born and raised in Indianapolis, Indiana. He graduated from Indiana University with an honors double major in medieval history and medieval civilization. After a 15-year career in the fine wine and spirits trade, he returned to academia and received his Master of Arts degree from the University of New Orleans after studying under such scholars as Stephen Ambrose and Michael D. Clark. If you are fans of Band of Brothers or the World War II Museum in New Orleans associated with Mr. Ambrose's work. He enrolled in the doctoral program at the University of Southern Mississippi with an emphasis on the study of American empire in the late Gilded Age. He is currently ABD, which means all but dissertation, and looks forward to finishing his project, which is entitled Imperial Tales, Race, Gender, and Empire in the Popular Literature of the Spanish-American War period 1895 to 1915. Impressive, isn't it? Some of the conference papers he has delivered include Appearances and Disappearances, Anglo-Saxonism and Exoticism, and the portrayal of Hispanic women in the imperial novels of the War of 1898, and at the Southern Historical Society Conference, New Orleans, Louisiana, where he presented that. He also presented Greater America, Empire, Nationalism, and the Foreign in the travel literature of the Spanish-American War period, 1898 to 1915. He presented that work at the Conference on Inter-American Relations, Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona. Mr. Walsh is a Cerebral Fellow. His hobbies include fine wines, billiards, bebop, reading history, and watching any sporting event with his son Nico, who is finishing his last year at the great Louisiana State University. Please welcome Mr. Walsh.
Thank you. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you all for coming today. There is some minor technical things, so if things start freaking out, blame someone else. The United States battleship, the USS battleship, the USS Maine, oh, make it stop. There we go. Lay quietly at rest in Havana Harbor on the calm and somewhat balmy evening of Tuesday, February 15th in the year of 1898. The ship and its crew of more than 300 sailors and officers had come to Cuba 3 weeks earlier at a troubled time in the island's history. Cuba, along with Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, were the last faded remnants of Spain's once great colonial empire, an empire that in the 16th century literally spanned the globe. But with the rise of various independence movements and an invasion of Spain by the soon-to-be Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, the country's far-flung empire was greatly reduced. And like an aging debutante or a Hollywood starlet who grasps tenaciously and desperately at what remains of her fading beauty, Spain clutched with ever more violence and repression to the few island colonies she had left. Holding on to Cuba at least at some level kept Spain at the table with the other great powers of Europe and justified the name of empire. In addition, and perhaps just as importantly, Cuba was a profitable colony for Spain, with its extensive sugar plantations, sugar mills, and rum distilleries. So it was not surprising that when the Cubans engaged in open rebellion for their independence, Spain reacted with remarkable levels of violence and repression. The rebels, or insurrectos, were especially strong in the countryside, where they could secure food, housing, and military intelligence from the local populations of like-minded Cubans. To deny this rural support for the insurgents, Spain began a policy of rounding up entire families and villages, men, women, and children, and throwing them into what they called reconcentrado camps. Indeed, this was the first widespread use of concentration camps in Western history. Perhaps not surprisingly, these camps were horrible places, with little food, less shelter, and virtually no medical facilities. Perhaps as many as 100,000 Cubans died in these camps. The Spanish governor who instituted the reconcentrado policy, Valeriano Weyler, soon gained the sobriquet Butcher Weyler. The challenge for the United States and its president, the Republican William McKinley of Ohio, was geography and economics. If the humanitarian crisis of the reconcentrado camps were happening halfway around the world in the far-off Philippines, an isolationist America would have gone along blissfully unaware. But Cuba was only 90 miles off Key West, Florida, and it was impossible to ignore such atrocities at America's doorstep. In addition, the aggressive yellow press of William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer put the issue of human rights, what were termed moral rights in the 1890s, on the front pages and at the center of American politics. But perhaps even more importantly, American businesses had significant interests and investments in Cuba. As the historian and diplomat Warren Zimmerman has noted, quote, Cuba was amazingly exceeded only by Britain and Germany as a source of imports into the United States. In other words, colonial Cuba stood at the top of the list of sources of American commerce. In addition, American-owned sugar plantations and distilleries, railroads, warehouses, and docking facilities amounted to millions of dollars that were now at risk as war and rebellion spread through the island. In the second week of January in the year of 1898, the colonial capital of Havana erupted in flames and violence as protesters poured into the streets. The American Consul General was genuinely concerned for the safety of his country's holdings in and around Havana. He telegraphed President McKinley and asked for a show of the flag to send the message to both Spaniards and Cubans alike that violence toward each other might be acceptable, but not toward any of Uncle Sam's investments. McKinley ordered the Maine to Havana on the 24th of January. Thus, the majestic white painted hull of the Maine glided placidly into Havana Harbor at 11 in the morning on January 25th in that fateful year of 1898. Though there was some anti-American sentiment in evidence on its arrival, the next 3 weeks were marked by very proper, if chilly, informal meetings and dinners between some of the officers of the Maine and the Spanish officials on shore. Indeed, the Governor General of the island, a man named Ramon Blanco, had exchanged gifts, of course Cuban cigars, with Charles D. Sigsby, the captain of the Maine. Captain Charles Dwight Sigsby was 53 years old as he captained the Maine in the early days of the war year of 1898. He had graduated from the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis in 1863. A career Navy man, Sigsby would go on to discover and chart what came to be called the Sigsby Deep in the Gulf of Mexico. While promotions for officers were rare and slow in coming, Sigsby was on his way up. His commission as captain was signed on April 10, 1897, when he took command of the Maine. After the battleship's arrival in the last week of January 1898, not much happened actually. Initially, officers from the ship were not allowed on shore. But eventually, that proscription was lifted and the officers enjoyed the sights of the city, visiting cafes and strolling the city's broad avenues and promenades. Some even attended a bullfight. Fearing an incident, however, the regular enlisted sailors, were forced to stay on board and hope for orders to leave Havana and visit New Orleans in time for Mardi Gras, as they had the year before when Fat Tuesday fell late on March the 2nd. On Tuesday evening, then, of February 15th, Captain Sigsby had enjoyed a fine Cuban cigar in the pleasant evening air while strolling on his ship's poop deck. After flicking the butt end of the cigar into the dark waters of Havana Harbor, he lingered momentarily and watched the orange glow of the cigar as it slowly extinguished beneath the waves. He returned to his cabin to complete some of the daily paperwork that is the bane of any officer's existence. As he wrote, his dog Peggy lay peacefully at his side. In the warmth of his cabin, he called for his African-American attendant, a man named James Pinckney, to bring him a lighter, more comfortable civilian jacket in which to do his evening's work. As the ship's bells signaled 9 o'clock, the Maine's Marine bugler, C.H. Newton, played taps, signaling to the crew that it was time to extinguish lights and turn in. As was his custom, Newton played the tune with military correctness, but with also flair and a rich phrasing that Sigsby always enjoyed and appreciated. As he worked, the captain absently stuck his hand in a jacket pocket and, to his embarrassment, discovered a letter there he was supposed to have mailed for his wife some 10 months before. Finishing his report, Sigsby quickly got to the task of apologizing to his wife in the letter home that he sent every night to his wife. Later, Sigsby would remember, quote, feeling quite a bit merry over the skills and felicity of his apology. As he inserted the note to his wife into an embossed envelope, the ship's bells chimed 9:30 p.m. They would not chime 9:45. What I would like to do now is to leave Captain Sigsby at his desk on that evening of February 15th, exercising good matrimonial practices. Here I would also like to leave his attendant Pinckney, who after bringing the captain his jacket had made his way forward to his bunk. Indeed, I would like to leave the Maine anchored there at mooring buoy number 4 with her 355 officers and crew as they began to bed down for the night. The enlisted sailors forward and officers aft. I would like to leave Havana and her harbor, which like the Maine had begun to quiet down as the tropical night came on. In our mind's eye, I would like to pull back from the ship in both space and time, past the Morro Castle and its lighthouse at the harbor's mouth, to pull back across the Gulf of Mexico, from the island's capital to the shores of Mississippi and Alabama's Gulf Coast, to the southern tier of states stretching from Texas in the west, to New Orleans and its world-famous Canal Street, eastward past the piney woods of Mississippi, the iron fields and foundries of northern Alabama, to the cotton mills of the Carolinas, and to Virginia's Piedmont and Tidewater regions. In other words, I would like to take a bit of a snapshot of the South in the second half of the 1890s, especially in terms of the movement that Southerners themselves called the New South. The South in the late Gilded Age was deeply rural and arguably still carrying the deep scars of 4 years of Civil War and rebellion. Average income levels and literacy rates, though improving, especially among whites, were still below those of the rest of the country. In terms of white literacy, Mississippi was at the very bottom of the list. The dislocation and disaffection that war and Reconstruction had brought were still etched on the economic and mental landscapes of the region. To make matters worse, the country was still suffering the lingering effect of the Panic of 1893, the worst depression in the country's history up till that time. Unemployment skyrocketed, nationally reaching 18% at its peak. As money supplies tightened, prices collapsed, as did farm values. Across the South, economic uncertainty stalked the countryside. Since the 1870s, this kind of economic prostration had made it clear that the South was ripe for change in leadership, a change in direction. It was in this context that a new generation of leaders would embrace something called the New South. These leading Southern men were an interesting and energetic lot. These, quote, new men were lawyers, lumbermen, railroad executives, and most importantly, newspapermen. Such high-profile newspaper editors and publishers as Daniel Augustus Tompkins, owner and editor of the Charlotte Observer, Henry Watterson of the Louisville Courier-Journal, and Henry Grady of the Atlanta Constitution were all fundamental in the formulation of what came to be called the New South Creed. They could and did use their paper's large circulation to spread the tenets of the very creed they helped to formulate. So what were the tenets of the creed? Recall what a creed is, a statement or listing of beliefs. Thus, the New South Creed was a statement of beliefs about the future of the South in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. At the heart of the creed was a vision of progress and change in the South, what one Southerner called a, quote, spirit of enterprise. Agriculturally, the dependence on single crop cultivation of cotton, sugar, and rice was to be tempered with a mixed crop system featuring fruits, cattle, grains, grasses, and even truck farms. The New South farmer was to be diversified, businesslike, and above all, scientific in the employment of new implements and techniques. Underlying the shift away from the farming patterns of the antebellum South was a two-pronged approach. On the one hand was an honoring of the past. the past of Uncle Remus, where, quote, smiling happy darkies labored contentedly in stately palatial homes. But on the other hand, there was to be rejection of the South's slaveholding past. The source of the South's backwardness was, in fact, slavery and the single-crop system. For New South boosters, the Civil War had not only liberated the slave, but it also liberated the slave owner. As Henry Grady of the Atlanta Constitution stated, quote, the shackles that held the South in narrow limitations fell forever when the shackles of the Negro slave were broken. A contributor to another New South mouthpiece, Baltimore's Manufacturer's Record, expounded further on the subject, quote, if ever man was impelled by an irresistible force, it was the Southern white man. He was bound hand and foot, bound to his slaves, bound to his plantation, bound to cotton, to his habits of life. In addition to a more diversified agriculture, the new generation must also embrace industrialism and manufacturing expansion as the key to lift the South out of a generational cycle of cotton, sharecropping, and poverty. Textiles mills in the Carolinas, iron foundries in surrounding Birmingham, Alabama, massive lumber mills here in the Piney Woods, and hundreds of miles of new railroad tracks would all catapult the South out of a position of economic prostration to a glowing future of wealth, stability, and solid middle-class progress. But the South faced two hurdles in implementing this third tenet of the creed: a lack of skilled laborers, managers, and, quote, scientific farmers. The second hurdle was an even more drastic deficit: lack of capital. New South boosters sought to overcome the first deficit by promoting the advantages of the region. New Southers did Horace Greeley one better. The cry should no longer be "Go west, young man," but "Go south." The challenge then was to attract a skilled management class and, even more importantly, millions of dollars of Northern capital to underwrite the industrialization of the region. But here the South faced an additional difficulty: reassuring conservative Northern investors that the era of secession, rebellion, and sectional strife was long past. On Wall Street, stolid Republicans and conservative gold-bug Democrats had vivid memories of lost investments because of Southern secession and the subsequent 4 years of destruction and dislocation. New Southers faced this challenge with this fourth tenet of the creed. The South would, quote, out-patriot the rest of the country in an unending chorus of unity, loyalty, and flag-waving hyper-Americanness. The Mississippian L.Q. Lamar, for whom I assume Lamar County is named, in a eulogy for the once-hated abolitionist Charles Sumner, orated, quote, "My countrymen, know one another, and you will love one another." The Confederate war hero, Wade Hampton, called on his fellow citizens to leave the Civil War in the past and, quote, "look to the future, when through all time the American flag shall float over a true and prosperous and reunited country." As the 1870s moved into the 80s and 90s, this renewed chorus of patriotism, what the historian Paul Gaston has perceptively labeled the gospel of union, shifted into high gear and began to have an effect. In 1886, Henry Grady was invited to speak at a society dinner made up of those Wall Street Republicans and gold-bug Democrats I had mentioned earlier, on the issues of sectional reconciliation and economic expansion. Too young to be tainted with a Confederate past, Grady sat comfortably at a speaker's table that featured William Tecumseh Sherman. After Sherman made a few remarks, a small band played "Marching Through Georgia." It would be hard to imagine a chillier environment for a Southerner. Yet Grady went on to deliver the most famous speech in New South history. Quote, "Southerners have sowed towns and cities in places of theories and put business ahead of politics. We have learned that one Northern immigrant is worth 50 foreigners and have smoothed the path to southward, wiped out the place where Mason-Dixon's line used to be, and hung out the latchstring to you and yours." His speech was a roaring success. Now, assuredly, the South would not apologize for its past, but at the same time, it would look firmly to the future. This last tenet of the creed, reconciliation and reunion, was most clearly directed to doubters and investors located north of that Mason-Dixon line that Grady had claimed the New South had wiped out. But arguably, the last tenet was directed first at Southerners, and then secondarily to Northerners. One of the underlying girdings of the New South Creed was an effort by the South to recover something from the catastrophic defeat of the idea of Southern independence that was the legacy of the Civil War. And what was to be recovered was control over what Gaston termed the region's, quote, racial self-determination. War and Reconstruction, of course, had brought an end to slavery, but it also brought Northern control of the issue of black racial equality and political justice. The last tenet of the New South Creed was indeed a call to the North for an acquiescence, a letting go of control of racial policy in the South. As the historian Gaston argued, the last tenet of the Creed asserted that conditions in the South, quote, could remain peaceful only if the South was left alone. By this reasoning, then, a Northern hands-off policy was insurance for the safety of Northern capital in the South. I came across this very argument while researching my master's thesis in the archives at LSU in Baton Rouge. I was looking at editorials in yet another of the New South newspapers that still exists today, the Memphis Commercial Appeal. I was looking for an editorial about the events of the Cuban Revolution that I began this talk with, and next to the one that I wanted, one was titled Hands Off. The thrust of the editorial was that Southern whites had almost 300 years of dealing, quote, with our Negroes, and Northerners clearly hadn't. Thus, Northerners were welcome to bring their capital southward, but they were to leave their, quote, alien notions of racial equality at home where they belonged. The North did indeed acquiesce, and the disfranchisement of Mississippi's black citizens was institutionalized in the Williams versus Mississippi Supreme Court decision in 1890. The tragic result was 70 years of Jim Crow with its segregation, lynching, and racial subjugation. Closer to home, the New South was indeed a topic of much discussion in Mississippi in the last third of the 19th century. Northern investments in the timber and rail industry were of particular importance to the region. But perhaps like everything else, Mississippi faced some unique challenges. One was the remarkable grip on state government that was exercised by the planter class of the Delta region. Industrialization was frowned upon by the landowning class because of fears that newer, higher-paying industrial jobs would either lure sharecroppers away from the plantations or at the very least force the owners to pay their agricultural workers a much more just and equitable living wage. Another challenge faced by the South was the grip in which yellow fever held the region. Historians estimate that the most deadly and destructive outbreak of the disease in the entire world, in the entire history of the disease, took place in 1878 in the area between Memphis and New Orleans. 10 to 20,000 people died in the lower Mississippi in that year alone. The key point was that in 1878, and again in later outbreaks in 1888, 97, 98, and 99, people believed that the disease was spread by human contact. So to protect themselves, their families, and communities, quarantines were imposed across the state, many of them of the informal, quote, shotgun variety. Not surprisingly then, commerce came to a screeching halt. In this context then, the historian Stephen Cresswell has written of one such incident, quote, outside of Jackson, angry citizens tore up the tracks of the Alabama and Vicksburg Railroad when they believed the railroad was disobeying the quarantine. News of the economic standstill, Cresswell continued, confirmed to Northern investors that the Deep South was no place to locate factories or to invest in banks or railroads or internet hardware. Okay. The irony for us here is that it was the Spanish-American War in Cuba, where thousands more soldiers died from yellow fever than from combat, provided the impetus for the eventual control of the disease. Important research here in Mississippi and in Cuba, part of it carried out by the famous Army surgeon Walter Reed, determined that the disease was not passed on by contact, but by the bite of the infected female of an indigenous species of mosquito. But the lure of thousands of acres of virgin longleaf pine drove Northerners to the Pine Belt anyway. Many of the great names of the era of intense first-growth lumbering were from outside of the state. J.J. Newman, for example, operated the largest mill in Hattiesburg and hailed from Buffalo, New York, by way of northern Pennsylvania. While the Tatums were Southerners from North Carolina and Tennessee, they were still, quote, out-of-staters when they toured the Pine Belt for the first time, visiting Hattiesburg and getting as far south as Poplarville in the summer of 1891. Down in Lumberton, the founder of the Edward Hines Lumber Company hailed from Buffalo by way of Chicago, and perhaps it was the Blodgett family from Grand Rapids that contributed a Michigan Street to Poplarville. Timber and lumber continued to contribute to the local economy here until the inevitable over-harvesting cleared virtually all of the virgin longleaf pines in the 1920s and 30s. Turpentine mills and tung oil production would at least partially fill the deficit. Now, after our perhaps too extensive look at Mississippi and the New South movement of the 1890s, I would like to return to Havana Harbor and the USS Maine as she lay at anchor on that Tuesday evening in February of 1898. Recall that taps had finished, and as had the apologetic letter from the pen of Captain Sigsby to his wife. Just before 9:45 that evening, two explosions rocked the Maine, literally splitting its forward half into an inverted V and lifting it several feet out of the water. Over 250 sailors and officers were killed immediately, including the bugler Reynolds and Sigsby's African-American attendant Pinckney. Witnesses described a hellish scene of fire, smoke, twisted metal, and most tragically, burnt, bloated, and dismembered bodies bobbing at the oily surface of the harbor. Not surprisingly, when the major American newspapers got wind of the story, the telegraph wires and front pages lit up with lurid illustrations and accusatory headlines. Almost immediately, fingers were pointed at the, quote, proud Spanish military whose honor had been compromised with the presence of the Maine in their colonial capital. Within days, a Navy investigative commission, complete with divers and naval architects, were on hand to investigate the tragedy. And again, perhaps not surprisingly, the Navy asserted the explosion had come from outside the hull of the ship. While the investigation never named names, American newspapers never hesitated to blame the Spaniards, who now acquired such new racial epithets as Dagos, Demon Dons, and Garlic Eaters. It is usually at this point that students ask what really happened to the Maine. Did the Spanish blow it up? Did the Cubans do it to get Americans all whipped up and come into the rebellion on their side? No one knows. The consensus, though, is that the ship blew up by accident when stores of gunpowder that launched the ship's large projectiles were detonated by a coal bunker fire that was a result of spontaneous combustion that superheated a shared bulkhead. As headlines screamed for war, the New South boosters were caught in a bind. Business and commerce were at the heart of the New South creed. But as was clear from the signals emanating from Wall Street, war with Spain was going to be bad for business. As Henry Watterson of the Louisville Courier-Journal had noted earlier, there was, quote, a big profit in minding our own business. Here in Mississippi and all along the Gulf Coast, businesses' call for restraint found many friendly ears. Part of the problem was geography. Shipping large bulk cargoes like lumber and grain to markets on the East Coast around the Florida Keys, just a few score miles from Cuba and a Spanish Navy with which we were at war, hardly seemed prudent. As one editor of the Atlanta Constitution put it, quote, a vessel from New Orleans to Havana should not have to be equipped to run a blockade. But also recall that one of the other key elements of the New South Creed was a kind of supercharged Americanism. Southerners would prove to Northern investors that the South had abandoned notions of rebellion and secession by being more patriotic than their Northern neighbors. Thus, while Watterson and others cautioned a pro-business restraint, a large contingent of New South boosters were advocating intervention on the island, citing everything from national honor and the flag to outright bloodlust and revenge. When the Navy report was published in March blaming the explosion on exterior underwater mines, there were few voices left for restraint, and Southerners volunteered in droves. Here in Mississippi, the state's original quota had been for 2 regiments, as well as other volunteers to fill out the so-called immune regiments. These units, the thinking went, would be made up of Southerners, white and black, in segregated units, who were thought to be immune or at least more resistant to yellow fever and malaria than Northern troops. Initially, volunteers were mustered into the 1st and 2nd Mississippi Infantry Regiment, while others went into the 5th U.S. Voluntary Infantry. A mustering center and training camp was set up outside of Jackson called Camp Pat Henry. The most famous of these volunteers was yet another newspaperman, James K. Vardaman of the Greenwood Commonwealth. Seeing the benefit that a successful military career would have on politics back home, the future governor of Mississippi secured a captain's commission in the 5th U.S. Volunteer Infantry. Arriving too late, he would see no combat. Instead, Vardaman would serve as chairman of the Army Court of Claims in Santiago. An indication that this was to be a truly global conflict came in the first large-scale action of the war, which took place not in Cuba, but in the Philippines. This large archipelago had been a Spanish colony for over 300 years, and it too had agitated and rebelled for its independence from Spain. Thus, there was a Spanish fleet of modern steam-powered warships stationed in Manila, the capital of the Philippines. A squadron of American warships under the command of Commodore George Dewey was ordered down from Hong Kong to attack and, if possible, destroy the Spanish fleet at Manila, the colonial capital. There we go. On the morning of May 1st, just before and just after breakfast, Dewey's squadron destroyed the Spanish fleet. America's Asiatic squadron lost no vessels and suffered only 9 casualties, none of them fatal. This is it's the only ship remaining from the Spanish-American War. It's Dewey's flagship. It's in a floating museum in Philadelphia. It's only partially restored. It's essentially a sister ship to the Maine. That's not quite accurate, but it gives you a sense of the size and the painting and decoration of the Maine. In the weeks following Dewey's remarkable victory at Manila, it became clear that the United States had not launched an amphibious invasion of a foreign country since the war with Mexico in 46 and 47. In other words, things went badly. Thus, the planning and execution of the invasion of Cuba did not go well. Units and troop transports were massed at Tampa. Spain's Asiatic squadron had been spotted and bottled up at Santiago de Cuba. Right here, Santiago de Cuba. Clearly the best Spanish port on the south side of the island, if not the best in the island itself. U.S. naval forces surrounded the mouth of the harbor. The Spanish fleet was thus trapped at Santiago so that the landing where the Fifth Army would not be near Havana where originally planned, but on the east end of the island near Santiago. American Marines landed in the nearby area surrounding Guantanamo Bay, securing a foothold the U.S. still maintains. The getting off of the ship on the east end of the island were largely unopposed at the small village of Daiquiri. It thus became patriotic at the time to order a daiquiri, always made with Cuban rum, and most often served with a small Cuban flag floating in it. Also fashionable and patriotic was the cocktail called a Cuba Libre, literally a free Cuba. A rum and coke with lime, again with the obligatory little Cuban flag bobbing around in it. After a few small and sharp skirmishes, the American Fifth Army approached Santiago from the east. Finally, on July 1st, American troops, professional soldiers and volunteers alike, Northerners and Southerners, whites and blacks, stormed the defenses around the harbor town. Here, Theodore Roosevelt, who had resigned from the Department of the Navy and commanding his own troop of volunteers, the now famous Rough Riders, made his way up what was actually called Kettle Hill. Roosevelt led a charge that would lead to victory that day, along with a political career that would finally land Roosevelt in the White House in 1901. This is the Rough Riders, the day of victory. This is one of my favorite photographs of Roosevelt. That's Roosevelt. These sort of rough-cut Rough Riders, an interesting amalgam of Western cowpunchers, bronco busters, and Eastern polo players and horsemen. You see here Roosevelt with his hand on his hips, supremely confident. What you don't see right away is that his wife has sewn about 7 pairs of glasses into his uniform because he's desperately nearsighted and he didn't want to shoot his own men if his glasses fell off. The other thing here, a prominent figure on his hip, his sidearm, is actually Captain Sigsby's Navy revolver. Sigsby had presented it to him after the destruction of the Maine with the hope, perhaps, of gaining some revenge. And indeed, Roosevelt will. There's eyewitness testimony of witness shooting a Spanish soldier at very close range, obviously. He's later nominated for and will receive posthumously the Congressional Medal of Honor for his actions that day. Less well known that day were the exploits of the 9th and 10th U.S. Cavalry, the so-called Buffalo Soldiers that had fought with distinction in the Indian Wars of the Great Plains. These African-American troops, too, helped secure a U.S. victory that day. The admiral commanding the Spanish fleet in Santiago Harbor ordered a desperate dash to escape the harbor and the American artillery that surrounded it. It didn't succeed. The Spanish fleet was destroyed, and this time only one American sailor was killed and no American ship was seriously damaged. With no navy to maintain its far-flung empire, an even smaller will to fight on, Spain sued for peace. Negotiations dragged on through the Christmas season, but eventually the Treaty of Paris was signed, granting Cuba its independence from Spain, but not its independence from U.S. intervention in the island's internal affairs for decades to come. Paying Spain an indemnity of $20 million, the U.S. acquired Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. In addition, in the white-hot war fever of the summer of 1898, America annexed the Hawaiian Islands as well. So what was the final tally for America's imperial adventures in the summer of 1898? For one, the exploits of on the hills surrounding Santiago would eventually lead Theodore Roosevelt to the White House, where he would shape both domestic and foreign policy for years, if not decades, to come. Then there was the physical and geographic extent of America's holdings. Though we would always term them territories, not colonies, the country's far-flung island possessions have made significant contributions to the nation's social, cultural, and political landscapes. See the little string of pearls thing I had on? Unfortunately for the Filipinos, that American imperial eagle was just that, imperial, as the Filipinos fought for their independence against American troops this time, as opposed to Spanish. Perhaps as many as 150,000 Filipinos will die in a failed attempt to secure its independence from the United States. And finally, for Southerners, the war provided a real episode of national healing, a chance to show their New South Americanness. Indeed, Southerners would volunteer for military service in 1898 in significantly higher ratios than their northern neighbors. As the historian Paul H. Buck has asserted, the Spanish-American War was the last stop, quote, on the road to reunion. I would like to leave y'all then with the image of Fightin' Joe Wheeler, a famous, chivalrous, and glamorous Confederate Civil War cavalry commander in the mold of Jeb Stuart and Nathan Bedford Forrest. In 1898, to facilitate the notion that this was a, quote, national war, President McKinley asked Wheeler to command the cavalry in Cuba, asserting that, quote, there must be a high officer from the South. Wheeler accepted. In a sharp action on the way to Santiago in late June of 1898, the American troops had driven the Spaniards back and indeed had them in full retreat. Confusing his enemies, but not his energies, Fightin' Joe allegedly hollered to his blue-clad troops, "Come on, boys, we've got the damn Yankees on the run." With that moment of national healing, I would like to end this morning's presentation. Thank you.